a little bit to the demand creation side and what I guess those expectations are for both demand on either side of the ledger. And that's when I'd really be delighted to bring Teresa and Robyn into the conversation and hand to them some of the excellent work that they've been doing with the Australian Procurement and Construction Council. And this is going to be more interactive. We really want you as participants on the other side of this to engage more deeply in this conversation, please, either through the chat or you can put your hand up and we'll bring you in. Thank you.
So thank you, Monica. I would like to start by acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people of the land on which I am meeting today. Those online, we acknowledge the First Nation lands on which you live and work. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and remain committed to working together to care for this land. So for those that may not know, my name is Teresa Scott and I'm the Executive Director for the Australasian Procurement and Construction Council, the APCC. We were established 55 years ago by government for government, and our remit is to break down the invisible walls between the jurisdictions and drive consistency in how governments buy and build through harmonising practices and approaches and by leading best practice. So currently all procurement policy owners across the states and territories, the Commonwealth and the New Zealand government are members of the APCC, as well as delivery agencies with significant procurement spend. As the peak body for government procurement, APCC facilitates collaboration and the sharing of information, intelligence, and insights. The APCC also has a leadership role to create national and New Zealand procurement agendas of significance, such as ESG and environmental outcomes. As you just heard, we today are asking the audience questions rather than presenting per se, but I would like to call out our support for what we heard from Adrian, and that we have found through our research that by the time these issues are considered at procurement stage, it is possibly already too late. So we need to move it forward to the business case. So we will be using Adrian's report quite extensively in the work that the APCC is doing. So next slide, please. And in fact, you can jump 2 slides. Okay, I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Robyn Hardy, who is the project lead, to facilitate some asking of questions.
Thanks, Teresa, and happy to be here, everyone. As Teresa's noted, that we've tasked with developing guidelines for procurement officers in government, and Hudson spoke earlier about policy levers, including procurement policy levers, but the world of procurement is a really complex one as well. So not only that whole area of all of sustainability policy is complex, but when you get down into procurement, the policy and implementation side of it is quite complex. And so our role is to develop a guide that actually can be used in practice. Now, procurement methods, we're looking here at methodologies in relation to contractual methods, setting of standards, setting of specifications, and we're also looking at the full gamut of government procurement in construction and infrastructure. And that ranges right from procuring tunnels and stadiums and bridges, but also things like footpaths and bus stops. So the range that we're dealing with here is quite massive. Traditionally, procurement is also seen as having a role when it comes to engaging the contractor to build the product. But in actual fact, procurement does have a role right back at the ideation stage. And we believe this is just in, as Adrian has presented, this is the place where most bang can be gained for our buck here. Procurement, in a sense, has a role right back at feasibility, where in a construction project, an infrastructure project, consultants are engaged to provide advice on the relative feasibility of the options that government is going to decide upon. And even in that stage, procurement is actually providing advice and a mechanism in the contracting of the consultants to provide that feasibility advice. So when you say that, or when someone says that we should be putting in some sort of benchmarking at that stage, we've got to work out a mechanism to advise procurement officers as to how would they engage those consultants, and often they're engineers, architects, but they're also such a broad variety of consultants to provide advice that go into the business case. We have to provide some sort of guidance to ask the questions to get those answers back in a format that will provide advice to government, which is comparing apples and apples. So what we're asking is a number of questions in relation to this problem that we have to develop these guidelines. And one of those is the readiness of industry. And remember that in our case, in government's case, industry means large tier 1 companies building tunnels in the centre of Sydney, and very small companies mending footpaths in small regional towns. We have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, quite a range of contractors that we deal with. As well as that, as I noted, we're working not only in large city urban areas, but we're also working in small regional towns. And so our the organisations that we're working with range from very small up to very, very large. We're also aware that there are a lot of tools out there presently which are helpful to this process. We know there's BIM capability tools which are plug-in, which measure emissions from the bill of quantities. We know, for instance, materials libraries are being developed at the moment by the Australian Institute of Quantity Surveyors and a number of other large quantity surveying companies, etc., to be able to respond to these needs that we have, as well as a whole lot of other libraries and tools. We want to know as much as possible about what tools are out there so that we can help officers on the ground in asking these questions in tender responses. We also want to know from you whether or not you feel if we imposed or asked for benchmarks or reports about emissions at this stage, would there be any disadvantages to any industry elements if we asked now, right now, today? And is there ways that we could ask those questions which wouldn't disadvantage people? For example, would we be shutting out some sectors of the construction industry? Are there limitations in measurement tools? Are there problems with the supply of green materials? And, you know, we have ideas about all of this, but we're asking you as experts in this field to advise us further here as we develop this guide. So thank you, and we value your feedback.
So Teresa and Robyn, I have asked people, you know, 1 or 2 people, perhaps, if they're willing to share some of those initial views on, you know, both the readiness of industry to respond to any more, you know, requirements around embodied carbon, but also what some of those potential disadvantages might be. And you know, you raise the issue about potentially regional communities or regional suppliers of materials might be disadvantaged if there were some specifications that they couldn't meet. And you know, it would be interesting to get a perspective on that. as well. And I'm assuming that at some point we'll have an opportunity for you to circulate a survey as well. So Peter Mulheron, I see you've put your hand up. Why don't you put yourself off mute and speak? We can spotlight you and you can speak.
Thanks very much, Monica. And thank you both, Teresa and Robyn. I think, yeah, it is a challenge for government. We touched on picking winners, but it is a challenge to say setting benchmarks. And of course, you're going to create challenges for some organisations. But I'd argue that's part of the transition. It is going to get hard for the laggards to maintain supply if they can't, bring their businesses up to that pace. I think I might have misunderstood, but there's inevitably going to be some, the leaders and the laggards and those in between. And then there has to be that incentive to, meet those benchmarks or meet the baselines and then start setting benchmarks. And I mean, I know there's schemes overseas in Japan, et cetera, where a minimum standard today becomes, in 5 years, unacceptable. So I think the role of government is to be setting those baselines and benchmarks and pull industry along, and there will be winners and losers there. But
thanks, Peter.
I'll leave it at that.
All right. And then Glenn Hedges. I'm going to spotlight you as well. There we go.
Yeah, thanks very much, Monica.
But you have to speak up a bit. We can't hear you all that well. And if you could put your camera on, that would be great.
Okay, how's that? I'll let the magic work. Here we go. So, I work for CPB contractors on major infrastructure projects. And in relation to the first question, is industry ready? I think the bottom line is fundamentally yes, but contractors will jump as high as the tenders and the details in a contract provides. And I think that's where there's been a lot of good intention over the last couple of years, and it's heading in the right direction. But I would insist that we are in a competitive tendering space, and contractors will respond to that where there is certainty, where there's consequences for not achieving some of these things. But we need to be explicit and how we contractualize some of these things. I'll leave it at that. That's my key point.
Fantastic, thank you. I will pin, Teresa, I'll pin you and Robyn back there. You might want to just make a response.
Yes, I agree with that. Certainty in the contract is important. The other thing was the contract model. Someone actually did say to me that one of the problems with one of the most popular contractual models at the moment is design and construct, and that leaves design way down in the pipeline, and that alliancing and traditional methods of construction where you fully design and document before you construct are better methodologies. Did you have a comment on that by any chance, Glenn?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. DNCs, hard dollar DNCs are there. And I think it really comes down to scoping these things in your technical requirements. There's got to be clarity as to what the asset owner wants and how and what they're looking for. So it really has to be stepped out so that everybody really understands and can respond to that.
All right, there's Adrian. Adrian, do you want to, I'll put you in the spotlight if you have a comment on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple of these. Firstly, I 100% agree with Peter. Like, extinction is a powerful force in this, and if we're driving the supply chain and saying that that those that don't perform over time with sufficient warning are going to lose out, that's an incredibly powerful motivator and one we should embrace. Alongside things like competition on it. But to the point Glenn just made, I've thought about this a lot, and there's kind of a unifying principle here, which is that for the last however knows how long, we've thought about the metrics of success in infrastructure as being time, quality, and cost, each of which we've got sophisticated mechanisms to measure. The future from this point forward has got to be time, quality, and cost plus carbon. And we've got to be able to measure that. That's got to be the unifying principle. There has to be a change of mindset to say all of those other things are important, but carbon is just as important. We have a budget for time because a minister said it's going to be open so I can cut a ribbon on this day. We have a metric for cost because we know what the budget is. We have a metric for quality because we have standards. But right now we don't have a budget for carbon. We don't have a price on carbon. And in the absence of those things, we've got to have it considered right from moment one and in the culture of a project. And to the other point that Glenn made, and in response to what Rob made, I don't know that the particular procurement methodology is necessarily the most important thing, so much as it is about being absolutely clear that carbon has to be thought of from moment one and driven through the contractual arrangements.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. And Teresa and Robyn, there are some comments in the chat there from Barrett Moulds. I suggest you have a look at those, and we're going to move on to our next speaker now. I thought that was some very useful feedback.